The morning started like any other. The sun had just crept over the rooftops, painting the quiet suburban streets in soft gold. Birds were chattering on the power lines, and sprinklers hissed gently across well-manicured lawns. For most people in my neighborhood, it was just another peaceful day in paradise. But I knew better. Living under the shadow of the HOA meant that peace was always fragile. Our so-called community board was less about maintaining beauty and more about control, especially in the hands of the self-appointed queen bee, Karen. She wasn't officially the HOA president, but anyone who lived there knew the truth: nothing happened in our subdivision without her approval. She monitored driveways, measured grass with a ruler, and even complained when Christmas lights weren't uniform enough. For months, I had kept my head down. I paid my dues, kept my yard tidy, and didn't give her any ammunition. But deep down, I knew she was just waiting for a reason to pounce. And that reason arrived the moment I drove home in my brand new Rolls Royce. Now, let me be clear, buying a Rolls Royce wasn't some vanity project. I had worked my entire life for that car. Years of building my business from scratch, sacrificing weekends, pouring everything I had into creating something lasting. This car wasn't just luxury. It was a symbol of the blood, sweat, and tears that had finally paid off. I'll never forget the first time I eased it into the neighborhood. The engine hummed like a lion, restrained, powerful but refined. The polished black exterior gleamed under the sun, and the spirit of ecstasy stood proudly on the hood. Neighbors paused mid-conversation as I rolled by. Some waved, some nodded in respect, and a few just stared with their jaws hanging open. But one pair of eyes burned hotter than the rest. Karen. She was standing at the end of her driveway, arms crossed, phone in hand, glaring like I had just committed the ultimate crime. Her bleach-blonde bob quivered with outrage, and her lips curled into a sneer before she even said a word. I didn't engage her. I just parked in my driveway, stepped out, and admired the car for a moment. The leather interior still had that new car smell, and the sunlight bounced off the chrome like fireworks. To me, it was a dream realized. To Karen, it was blasphemy. The next day, the letters started arriving. First came the friendly reminder about parking oversized luxury vehicles in driveways. Then the notice about community guidelines concerning excessive displays of wealth. By the third letter, she had escalated to threats of fines, citations, and even towing. It would have been laughable if it weren't so absurd. The HOA bylaws said nothing about luxury cars. Trucks, RVs, boats, yes. But a car, no matter how expensive, was still just a car. And yet Karen was determined to twist the rules to her will. At first, I tried to ignore it. I thought maybe she'd get bored once she realized she had no authority over my vehicle. But that wasn't Karen's way. She thrived on control, and if she couldn't bend me through letters, she'd escalate. And escalate she did. It began with constant drive-bys. She'd circle my house on foot, peering at the car like a detective inspecting evidence. Sometimes she'd stop and take photos, pretending to text while clearly recording me. Other times, she'd flag down other neighbors and whisper to them while pointing at my driveway. It was obvious she wanted to make me a public enemy. But what she didn't realize was that the more she pushed, the more determined I became to stand my ground. I wasn't about to let someone else dictate how I celebrated my success. The breaking point came one evening when I returned from a business dinner. The street was quiet, but as I pulled in, headlights suddenly flicked on behind me. Karen's SUV. She had been waiting in the dark like some kind of predator. She didn't just follow me into my driveway, she blocked me in. When I stepped out of my Rolls Royce, she was already out of her car, phone camera trained on me, ranting about flagrant violations, property values, and unacceptable displays of arrogance. Her voice carried through the neighborhood, and porch lights started flicking on as curious neighbors peeked out. I tried to reason with her, but she wasn't interested in reason. To her, this wasn't about a car, it was about control. And when she realized she couldn't scare me with HOA rules, she dialed 911. Within minutes, red and blue lights flooded the street. And that was the beginning of the night everything spiraled out of control. The night I ended up in handcuffs for the crime of owning the wrong car in the wrong neighborhood. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the polished curves of my Rolls Royce like a cruel joke. I stood there, arms folded, watching as 2 squad cars pulled up in front of my house. Neighbors gathered on porches, whispering and pointing like they had front row seats to some twisted neighborhood drama. And at the center of it all, Karen. She was standing with her arms flailing dramatically, pointing at me, then at the car, then back at me again, as if she had just caught a hardened criminal red-handed. Her voice rose higher and shriller with every word. "Officer, that vehicle is a violation of HOA guidelines. He refuses to comply. He's threatening the value of all our properties." I couldn't help but scoff. I had heard lies before, but the sheer conviction in her voice was impressive. She spoke as if my Rolls Royce was some kind of toxic waste barrel poisoning the entire neighborhood. The officers exchanged a glance, clearly trying to make sense of the situation. One of them, a tall man with a weary look, stepped toward me. "Sir, mind explaining what's going on here?" "Yeah," I replied calmly, "I bought a car. Parked it in my own driveway. That's the whole story. I gestured toward Karen, doesn't like it." Karen gasped like I had just committed blasphemy. "Don't you dare downplay this. That car doesn't belong here. This is a family neighborhood, not some flashy car show." I raised an eyebrow. "With all due respect, Karen, last I checked, there's no law against owning a car. And the HOA bylaws don't say a single word about luxury vehicles. Trucks. Boats. RVs. Sure. But a car is a car. You don't get to rewrite the rules just because you're jealous." That word, jealous, hit her like a thunderclap. Her face flushed red, her jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought she might actually explode. Instead, she doubled down. "Officer, he's harassing me now. He's targeting me. Look how aggressive he's being." I blinked in disbelief. Aggressive? I hadn't even raised my voice. Meanwhile, she was practically foaming at the mouth. The officer sighed, clearly realizing he'd walked into a circus. HOA disputes aren't really police matters unless there's an actual crime. Karen wasn't having it. She jabbed a finger at me. "Then arrest him for disturbing the peace. 4 intimidation. 4 for something." The second officer, a younger guy who looked fresh out of the academy, gave me a sympathetic look, but still stepped closer. "Sir, if you could just keep things calm, maybe park your car in the garage to avoid conflict." That was the line that broke my patience. I'm not hiding my car like it's contraband. I worked hard for it. I have every right to park in my own driveway. What's next? Will she tell me what color curtains I can use in my house? This is ridiculous. My tone was firm, not hostile, but Karen immediately seized the opportunity. See how combative he is. I don't feel safe." And that's when she pulled her trump card. In front of everyone, neighbors, officers, and the glowing cameras of half a dozen smartphones, she dramatically clutched her chest, stumbled back a step, and shouted. "He threatened me. He said he'd make me pay if I didn't stop bothering him." The crowd gasped. The officers froze. And I stood there stunned. "I never said that," I shot back immediately. She's lying. But the damage was done. The older officer exchanged a look with his partner, then turned back to me. Sir, at this point we're going to need to de-escalate this situation. Please turn around. My stomach dropped. You can't be serious. Turn around, sir. Hands behind your back. The metallic click of handcuffs snapped through the night air, and a murmur rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Some shook their heads, others whispered to each other, and a few even filmed the entire thing with wide-eyed fascination. Karen. She looked triumphant. She stood a little taller, chin raised, lips curved in a smug smile that said, I win. To her, this wasn't just about the car anymore, it was about power. She had managed to get the police to cuff me on my own driveway, in front of the entire neighborhood. But what she didn't realize was this: her victory was temporary. Because while I felt the cold bite of steel around my wrists, deep inside I wasn't panicked. I knew the truth was on my side. And sooner or later, her lies would unravel. As they walked me toward the squad car, I caught the faint reflection of my Rolls Royce in the rear window. The spirit of ecstasy stood tall, unmoved by the chaos swirling around it. And in that moment, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning of a battle Karen wasn't prepared for. The backseat of a police cruiser isn't nearly as glamorous as Hollywood makes it look. There are no plush seats, no comforting silence, just hard plastic mold to fit like a punishment chair and the faint smell of sweat and disinfectant. The cuffs bit into my wrists with every bump of the road, but the worst part wasn't the discomfort. It was the humiliation. From the corner of my eye, I could see neighbors still filming as the squad car pulled away. Karen was practically basking in the glow of her own performance, her smug grin illuminated by the flashing lights. She didn't just want me in trouble, she wanted me humiliated, publicly crushed. At the station, the routine was mechanical. Name. Address. Fingerprints. A mugshot under the harsh glare of fluorescent lights. I answered every question calmly, though inside, frustration churned like a storm. I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. This wasn't justice, it was theater, scripted by Karen and fueled by her obsession with control. After processing, they put me in a holding cell. The iron door clanged shut with a finality that made my stomach tighten. I sat down on the cold bench, staring at the scuffed concrete floor, and replayed everything in my mind. Every word, every accusation, every lie. I hadn't threatened her. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't broken a single law. So why was I sitting in a cell? Hours crawled by, punctuated by the occasional echo of boots in the hallway, or the clatter of paperwork behind the front desk. I kept reminding myself, the truth doesn't bend. Karen could spin her story all she wanted, but eventually, facts win out. And sure enough, the cracks began to show sooner than I expected. An officer came by, holding a clipboard, his expression caught between annoyance and curiosity. You're the guy from the Rolls Royce mess, right? I nodded. He exhaled, leaning against the bars. You're lucky. We pulled the neighborhood security cam footage. Doesn't look like you did any of the stuff she accused you of. I felt a flicker of relief. Because I didn't. He gave me a look that said he half believed me already. Yeah, I figured. Honestly, we get calls from that lady all the time. Complains about everything, mailboxes, lawn ornaments, you name it. Half the department knows her by name. That admission sent a wave of vindication through me. Karen's reign of terror wasn't just confined to the HOA, she had been wasting police time too. But the officer wasn't finished. The thing is, when someone claims they feel threatened, we don't have much choice. We have to respond. That's why you're here. Covering bases, you know. I nodded slowly, swallowing the bitterness rising in my throat. It wasn't the officers' fault, they were just doing their jobs. Karen had manipulated the system, as she always did, bending it to her will. Look, he continued, you'll probably get released soon. We just need to wrap up some paperwork. But between you and me, if I were you, I'd keep a paper trail. Document everything. She's the type who won't stop until she's embarrassed herself in front of a judge. That advice stuck with me. I thanked him, then leaned back against the wall, my mind already racing. Karen wanted a war. Fine. But this time, I'd fight her on her own battlefield, with records, facts, and proof she couldn't spin. By the time they finally let me out, dawn was beginning to creep into the sky. The air outside was cool, crisp, and tasted sweeter than it ever had. A cab dropped me back at the neighborhood entrance, and as we rolled past the familiar manicured lawns, I could already picture Karen's reaction when she saw me return. Sure enough, as I walked up my driveway, there she was, standing at her window, arms folded, peering through the blinds like a hawk. The second she saw me, her jaw dropped. She had expected victory, permanent humiliation. Instead, I was back, unbroken, and angrier than ever. I didn't acknowledge her. I simply unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and let the silence of my home swallow me whole. But inside, my thoughts weren't silent. They were loud, sharp, and filled with resolve. Karen had crossed a line. And I was done playing nice. If she wanted to drag me into the mud, she was about to learn that I knew how to fight, and that the truth had a way of burning through every lie, no matter how many times she repeated it. Because this wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about freedom, dignity, and proving that no self-appointed tyrant could control me. And I was ready to fight back. When I closed the front door behind me that morning, something shifted. It wasn't a triumphant victory march. I had been cuffed, humiliated, and my neighborhood gossip reels were probably still running, but it was the moment I decided not to let the story end in someone else's favor. Karen had shown the world she could weaponize petty power. I was going to show the world how badly that backfires when people with facts and patience respond. First step, paperwork. The officer's offhand advice, keep a paper trail, felt like a starting pistol. I dug out every letter the HOA had ever sent me, scanned them, time-stamped photos of the rolls in my driveway, saved the videos neighbors had posted, and pulled footage from my doorbell camera. I printed receipts, ownership documents, and correspondence with the dealership. I filed a formal complaint with the police documenting the timeline, Karen's stalking behavior, her escalation, her false claim about being threatened. I wasn't trying to get revenge so much as I was building an unassailable record. Neighbors who'd watched the scene unfold started popping by. Some were hesitant at first, fearful of Karen's wrath, but when I showed them the security footage of her blatantly fabricating the threat, the hesitation dissolved into outrage. Mrs. Patel from 2 houses down admitted she'd been the target of Karen's petty inspections for years. Mr. Alvarez confessed he'd been shamed publicly for the color of his mailbox. My living room turned into a collated dossier of grievances, and everyone who'd been cowed by Karen began to feel like they'd found a place to finally be heard. The HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday. I'd requested to be put on the agenda to discuss the harassment and to challenge the guideline notices. It felt strange, assembling legal sounding points, rehearsing what to say in front of men and women who believed they'd built a perfect little world, but when the night came, I walked into that meeting with a folder under my arm and a determination that had nothing to do with my car and everything to do with principle. Karen arrived in a flurry of perfume and righteous indignation, as if the world owed her an explanation. The room filled with familiar faces, many of them wary. The president of the HOA, an elderly man, who'd always smiled politely and signed Karen's petitions without question, sat at the head of the table. He glanced at me with a look that betrayed that he'd seen the footage before the meeting. I'd contacted him earlier and handed over copies of everything, asking him to review before the inevitable spectacle. When my name was called, I stood and felt a hush fall over the room. I didn't shout. I didn't denounce. I presented. Calmly, methodically, I laid out the timeline, the arrival of the Rolls, the petty letters, the harassing patrols, the staged confrontation, the police response, and the security footage that contradicted Karen's story. I handed printed stills to the board, put my phone up to the projector, and let the video play. The footage was damning in its simplicity. There was Karen, pacing in front of my house, phone in hand, speaking into it, clearly making exaggerated gestures, then pointing at me as I walked up my driveway. There was no raised voice from me, no visible threat, and no evidence of intimidation. The part that mattered most, a clip where Karen, off camera, could be heard saying to someone, "Just tell them he threatened you, say anything." Her voice, shrill and ordinary, echoed in the room. You could feel the air change. Faces went pale. Murmurs rose. Even Karen's allies, those who'd nodded along with her petty edicts, shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The HOA president cleared his throat. "Karen," he said, "is this true?" It was a small, careful question, the kind that implied consequences. Karen's eyes flickered. For a moment, she looked like a woman seeing a future she hadn't planned for. Then she blinked, summoned an anger that had always served her, and replied with the practiced indignation of someone who'd been called out before. "I was protecting the community," she snapped. "He's a show-off, and I have every right to." "You lied to the police," the president interrupted, voice firm now. He looked at the assembled board. "We cannot have someone making false accusations and weaponizing emergency services. It makes us all look bad, wastes department time, and endangers the integrity of our community." The board voted. It was not the dramatic public execution some onlookers had hoped for, but it was formal and irreversible in its own way. Karen was censured for harassment, fined for repeated violation of HOA conduct standards, and ordered to attend mediation. The HOA also voted to create a formal policy clarifying that private vehicles, regardless of price, are not subject to regulation by the board unless they violate existing, specific rules. It was a long overdue correction to the bylaws, one that would prevent the same nonsense from happening again. But the HOA's reprimand was only part of it. I had filed a police report for the false claim that had led to my arrest. After reviewing the footage and interviews from multiple witnesses, the district attorney's office pursued charges for filing a false police report. It wasn't a sensational headline, these cases rarely were, but there was a quiet, methodical justice to it. Karen received a summons. She had to sit across from investigators, explain herself, and, most damaging, answer questions under oath. The court outcome wasn't a dramatic prison sentence. It was paperwork, fees, and a formal reprimand that would sit on public record for years. More importantly, it neutered her power. People who had once been intimidated into silence now walked a little taller. Those petty drive-bys dwindled. The neighborhood that had once whispered behind closed curtains began to talk openly, to set boundaries where none existed, and to hold the HOA accountable instead of letting one person redefine civility. As for me, the Rolls sat in my driveway the whole time, an emblem of stubbornness more than luxury. There were still sideways glances and a few cold shoulders, but there was also a sense of normalizing, of the neighborhood returning to being a place where people minded their own business and respected each other's property. One late afternoon, weeks after everything had settled, Karen came to my door. She did not stomp or demand. She came with a small envelope and eyes that had lost the confident fire. She mumbled something, an apology of sorts, though thin and defensive. I accepted the envelope. Inside was a check that covered some of the fines she'd incurred and a note that said, "I was wrong. I'm sorry for the trouble." I could have escalated. I could have demanded more, pressed for a heartfelt apology in front of the entire neighborhood, or insisted she move away as a condition of truce. Instead, I put the envelope on my kitchen counter, closed the door, and felt something I didn't expect: relief. Not triumph. Not gloating. Relief. Justice, in the end, wasn't about humiliating Karen more than she already had been. It was about restoring what had been taken: my dignity, the right to live without consternation over a car in my driveway, and the knowledge that the truth mattered. The community learned how to stand up to a bully without becoming bullies themselves. I learned that patience, plus a good camera, solid records, and neighbors willing to speak up, can dismantle a tyrant built on rumor and fear. On quiet nights, when the spirit of ecstasy catches the moonlight and everything is still, I sometimes think about how small moments build a life. That car had been me reaching a milestone. Karen had tried to make it a spectacle. But the story didn't end with me in handcuffs. It ended with a neighborhood that remembered what fairness looked like, and with me driving on, careful not to let anyone else dictate the shape of my success.